Up until recently, it seemed to me that the political regime in Russia, based on the lies, based on the insolence of office, xenophobia, and the high-handedness of the authorities, is some sort of an aberration with respect to the liberal mainstream of the world politics. However, in 2015 and in 2016, unfortunately, we could see that the mainstream is rapidly converging with Putin's Russia, and something that we can see such alternative facts or post-truth politics, such indeed hideous concepts. The general aggressive xenophobia, isolationism, and populism in its most abominable manifestations are becoming very prominent in countries that had, until that time, perceived as the citadels of democracy, which is what we saw in Britain during the Brexit referendum, and we certainly saw it during the electoral campaign in the United States. This is what we indeed see as a style in Mr. Trump's administration. Even in those countries where the right-wing populists have not come to power, such as the Netherlands, where the right-wing politicians gained only 13% of the vote. However, they were able to impose their agenda on the electoral campaign and at least enter the media space. To his arguments that he would shut the door of the Netherlands, the Prime Minister and the leader of the centrist right party, Mark Rutte, and Friedrich Eriksson already mentioned him, the man who won in the election, he made a slogan in his campaign. Holland or the Netherlands must stay the same. Our values need to be protected. So even in Holland, in the Netherlands, historically, traditionally, a liberal country, has introduced into the public rhetoric the overtones of Islamophobia, and indeed this country has even had some discussions about leaving the EU. Yet another important circumstance, which is what we expect to happen in France as the result of the presidential elections, irrespective of the actual result. We can say that regardless of the winner, which is that if Mr. Macron wins the elections, however, take it or leave it, the National Front has been able to introduce the bullet points of the French identity into the electoral campaign. So there is, as many observers say, there is an important victory that has already been won by Marine Le Pen. Let me also very briefly say something that is very important, which is the causes of this right-wing, isolationist, xenophobic populism in the leading countries of the West. Let me give some definition, a definition of what I call, of what I really call populism, which is indeed a broad term. And apart from being pejorative, it also sometimes becomes desubstantiated. And I want to give some definitions. So in my view, it is a phenomenon which is primarily characterized by an appeal to the leader, and it's what we call a direct communication between the people and the leader above the head of the institutions. So, what are the reasons for it to become so widespread? Well, one of the reasons is the deindustrialization, loss of jobs, deepening inequality, migration flow, development of social networks, and thus the new strata of the society, which have been the losers in globalization. Those who stopped being particularly, who have been left behind by globalization. Any democracy is stable when the channels of representation are efficient and when they step for the majority of the population. So these institutions were unfortunately permeable for the anti-systemic sentiment. The defeat of Mrs. Clinton in the presidential elections and the defeat of the pro-Europe movement in Britain at the same time became a loss of the supporters of globalization, something that the Road to Somewhere British author said that it's a movement anywheres. And according to Goodhart, these are the somewheres, the people who live in a specific place. Not anywheres, but somewheres. According to David Goodhart, the watershed in Britain is between those who come from somewhere and who are rooted in some society or community, a small town. It's a socially conservative person, somebody who is maybe less educated, and those who are people from the anywheres, the liberal-minded dwellers of major cities with university degrees. According to Mr. Goodhart, they're about half population of Britain. Anywheres are 22 to 25%, and those in-betweeners are the rest. So the 50%, 25%, and the in-betweeners. So in his book, he is quoting the 2011 poll, whereby 62% of the Brits agreed with the following statement. Britain has changed so profoundly over the past decades that it is no longer recognizable. Sometimes I feel myself being abroad, which causes my discomfort. We can see and we can hear the same rhetoric on the part of the left populists, like La France Insoumise in France, or the Spanish leftist parties. The people against the elites, those left behind in globalization against the beneficiaries of globalization, rural area against cities, university degree owners against the illiterate or the low educated, harsh politics against liberalization. These rifts between those who are oriented towards the openness and those who are oriented towards the identity preservation and the closure of borders is becoming the greatest watershed in modern affairs. A lot more important than the social ideological divides as the cleavages along the lines of the right and the left. And clearly we are seeing the end of the cycle of stable institutional development, which is quite apparent in the West. The main achievement of the post-war period, to me, was the liberal penchant for freedom and the social democratic penchant for justice. In my view, this was the basis of liberal democracies in the 70 years after World War II. And by voting for special parties of the right wing and the left wing, most voters were able to project their interests into the state politics, which led to stable economic growth and the rise and expansion of the middle class. Under the new reality, including the increasing automation of industries and globalization, which means more and more of the liberal principle of freedom, which is probably the summit of liberal idea in the scale of Earth, which is what the European Union indeed championed on the continent. And as distinct from the anti-globalists, this has led to the embetterment of the millions of people, social and economic status in Mexico, Bangladesh, and elsewhere. However, this very process, which led to the capital outflow to the once pauper countries, at the same time led to certain economic hardships to befell to befall the certain strata of the societies, with the so-called rusty belts expanding in the United States and elsewhere in the world. The growing inequality in the distribution of the revenues over the past 30 years, the shrinking of the middle class, the growth of the super rich have all and are all perceived as the consequences of globalization, which is important, specifically important in terms of the social democratic model, and indeed the working class. The economic crisis of 2008 through to 2009 and the ensuing recession have exacerbated these problems to their utmost. Interestingly, these problems have received their political manifestation in the right-wing populist movement of 2016, at the very time when there was a certain growth to be noted in the Western world. Mr. Eriksson said that this growth is not particularly pronounced. However, we can see that 2006 did see some growth. So I would not wish to say that this is a stagnation, but it still is moving ahead. So these social consequences of the great political shifts pose the question of the ability to compare the end of this cycle, which is the cycle of 1945 through to 2015, and its political consequences. So we're certainly seeing at the end of the cycle. The previous cycle, as we believe, ended in 1929 through to 1930, which was the first major crisis of the industrial capitalism. So it is unclear if fascism is fascism an outdated concept, or else, as Bertolt Brecht sadly said, this womb may still bear the terrible fruit. So indeed, if we can compare the crisis of today with the crisis of the 1930s, we still do not know. But what is important is that we have to try and be very vigilant with respect to what will be happening to the democratic institutions, if they're ready for transformation, if they can be efficient channels for standing up for the values, or else the world has entered the crisis of a democratic system. The right-wing conservative parties are unfortunately seeing growth of authoritarian tendencies. Let me speak about this crisis on the example of crisis of the presidential system in the United States and in France. Let me also say that when Mr. Trump when Mr. Trump came to power, and I thought that he would lose. We had a bet with Mr. Zakharov at that time, and I lost, and so I and I agreed to write 3 articles for his magazine where he's the editor-in-chief. So I indeed lost in terms of my liabilities. Although on the other hand, I was happy that I was given the opportunity to write the articles. Well, however, what we're seeing is that in the United States, we were told by many is that the institutions in the U.S. are so strong that they would inhibit Mr. Trump from implementing his political program. So how this is something that we spoke about in the beginning of the 1990s with respect to the Latin America, is that the presidential system in the U.S. is an exemption rather than a rule. The political system, which presupposes a very strong, popularly elected executive, and the administration, which is under the president, has only become successful in the United States. And so what are these institutions? It is primarily the checks and balances principle, the division of powers, the special role of the Supreme Court as an arbiter between the legislature and the president and the federal and state authorities. All of these have allowed the United States to avoid the civic strife and the constitutional crisis, even when the Congress and the administration were from different parties. So the bipartisan system played a special role in this, in the situation when the parties up until the past 20 years were not particularly different from each other on the main and along the main lines. And they absorbed the main part of the spectrum of political perceptions. Along the same lines, we can see that the presidential system in the U.S. is efficient because many important areas of decision-making are controlled by the state authorities. All politics is local politics is indeed material in the United States, as it is definitely expressed in the devolution of federal power. And indeed, the fact that the state budgets taken in total exceed the federal budget is a very important peculiarity. Under these conditions, the presidential system could be very successful in the U.S., which was, of course, a world of difference from the South America and Central America, where the constitutions were indeed copied from the U.S. Constitution, with one conspicuous exception, that the absence of the division of powers, the absence of civic control over the army, and indeed the absence of the federalist principle, and the fact that these were highly socially divided. All of these circumstances led to a situation in the South American countries where the presidents, while they had all prerogative, were in fact powerless and becoming hostages in the hands of the military. If we go back to the U.S. example, we are seeing the unfortunate situation when the very things which were under the forces which were at work have now led to the marked diminution of the efficiency of this system, and the rise of the anti-systemic or anti-establishment sentiments, which eventually led to the victory of Mr. Trump. If we look at the role of the political parties in the United States, then this situation changed noticeably. First of all, in the past years, the two main parties, Democratic and Republican, became embodiments or manifestations of a deeply divided society in terms of close socially and ideologically, and indeed we're seeing the decreasing role of political parties. So Mr. Trump, in this sense, had a great trouble, and while he had this trouble, he was able to defeat his own party rivals by indeed making an almost judo throw and counteracting his own competitors in the Republican Party. So what we're seeing in this sense is that the dilemma in the U.S. For the Republican Party, if they should continue supporting Mr. Trump. And let me just quote the example of the Congress Committee on the relations with Russia and the Russian security forces. The House of Representatives demanded to identify those in the administration of Mr. Obama who were responsible for the leak. And one of the actual tasks was to identify this leak.
The New York Times wrote on this that the Republicans in general, according to the Constitution, members of the House of Representatives are an independent branch of government. But in the Congress, they acted like members of the staff, as if they belonged to Trump's team. This is something we well know of, we are very familiar with. I'll point out in brackets. As to the Democratic Party, the question for them is how to oppose. Therefore, the Democrats seek to focus their attention on Trump, on his aides, on the Russian intervention. I'd like to say that this investigation can last years and continue to sort of be pending over Trump, depending on how well the situation will develop in the domestic policy and in the foreign policy. In simple words, either they will forget about this under the influence of bombing Assad's airports and aerodromes, or they will not. So much for the parties. A second peculiarity of the presidential system in the US is, you may put it like, protecting the system from marginals. In the US, as you know, unlike France, there's no such thing as a second tour. And the 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump, is an outsider. It's the first President of the United States who had not taken any government post before he assumed power as President, be they elected posts or by appointment, or he never did national service in the army. And I'd like to say that in general, a person who doesn't belong to the system, well, such candidates did take place in the presidential election. It's pretty interesting, I'll just mention it, that in '64, Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater was a candidate from the Republican Party. He obtained 38% votes and won in 6 states. So, therefore, at that time, it was an obvious reflection of racism and right conservatism, because it was the only time when this person like this was candidate. A person with similar mindset in 1968, but from the Democratic past, Governor of Alabama, George Wallace, several times attempted to become presidential candidate from the Democratic Party, but took part in 1968 as a candidate from the American Independent Party. As a result, 10 million votes, 46 electors' votes, and 5 states in the Deep South. Ross Perot, in 1990 to 1996, as an independent candidate, never received 1 vote. Bill Clinton received vote then. So never once in the modern history of the United States we have seen a situation that is, in some extent, similar to the one we have today. That is when a non-system candidate who didn't go through the machinery of either party, who denies politics per se, who looks as governance and national governance as business, who doesn't conceal his racist and xenophobic views or others, heinous views, not only becomes a candidate from one of 2 system-making parties, but also gets a triumphal victory on the primaries over all the candidates put forward by the establishment of the party, and is elected. Thirdly, special feature of American system. This is electoral college. Unlike those who believe this is something anachronistic, what I'm saying is that Americans, in point of fact, have a direct vote, but they vote for the electors, sort of, in each state, with the exception of 2 states that have some deviations. The main rule is like this, that the candidate who won in the state gets the votes of all the electors in the state, for this state. I suppose this system, at least as I understand it, had good rationale and still means a lot. This is a combination of the advantage of majority system as well as proportionate in the framework of federal state. It allows to sort of somehow smooth situations where a candidate is elected through the majority of votes only in the biggest and strongest states. In this sense, election of Trump is a really serious failure of the system, because, as you know, Trump obtained 3 million votes less than Clinton, but at that, He received 306 electors' votes against 332 against Clinton's. 233 probably. And that is particularly seen when the results in the key states, how close they were. Such close margin. For example, in Florida, the difference was only 120,000 votes between two main candidates. Next typical feature of the American system is most important for the division of government. This is judicial review. Thank you. So, in point of fact, the role of the Supreme Court, which is entitled with the right to make evaluation, to return judgment on whether any piece of legislation is constitutional. This is truly something very important for the successful work of the American presidential system. We could see that presidential decree on temporary ban for entry into US for citizens from 7 countries in the Middle East were first blocked by the state of Washington, who suspended this decree across the territory of the United States. Besides, in further 16 states forbade the execution of this decree as something violating freedoms and rights, and the Court of Appeal also supported this. The same happened with a second decree, that is amended decree on the same topic, and it was suspended by the state of Hawaii. But here the important role is played by the Supreme Court, that was paralyzed in the last year because the Republicans in the Senate refused to approve the candidates put forward by President Obama. And on the 7th of April, that is very recently, they approved Lord Neil Gorsuch, but he was approved by the simple majority of 54 votes. And this is something contrary to the custom. And last important point in the division of government is what is known in America as divided government. This is a situation which, I'll put it this way, it's rather a rule since the late 1960s rather than an exception when the president, who belongs to one political party, and the majority in the House of Representatives and the Senate goes to the other parties. It's a pretty exciting story how it happened and how it evolved, but the situation of the divided government was rather a rule rather than an exception in the prior 48 years since 1968, and under Democratic presidents as well as under Republican presidents. Since the situation where when the Republican Party controls both the executive and the two chambers of the Congress. For example, Reagan had the majority in the Senate, but the minority in the House of Representatives. But the situation when one and the same party, that is the Republican Party, controls the majority in both houses as well as the executive government, this is something that they first saw since 1953. In 1953, President Eisenhower was president. So I'd like to single out, one more point about the role of federation. I'm very sorry, I have no time because I want to say a few words about France. But looking at this clock, I can see with horror that my time is running out. What I want to mention is that indeed, the federative structure of the government, that is resistance by the state, especially of a state such big and important as California, so far is the bastion of resistance to Trump's policies. The same might be said about the press, such pillars of liberal journalism as the New York Times or the Washington Post, or strange as it may seem for me, and they became a discovery for me, to the special services in America who weren't against with a story about the investigation of the links of the closest people on Trump's administration with the Russian special services. They also spoke as defenders of democracy. As I enumerated these factors in this situation with the democratic institutions in the US, I suppose I would agree with what was written by the New York Times a well-known American researcher of Turkish descent, Daron Çamoglu. He thinks that despite this force and the resistance through the number of institutions, in principles, each of them and all of them, as I said, are not prepared to oppose the phenomenon which is embodied by Trump. Well, let me quote, please. The threat of personal government, personified government, where civic institutions such as bureaucracies and courts become completely controlled by the executive, and the difference between the interests of the state and personal interests of the ruler is beginning to disappear again. Unlike the Latin American democracies where the interests of economic and political interests of the dominant groups are often personified. In Russia, we can see it too. Russia is a country that is owned by the people who are in executive government. This sort of lack of division between personal economic interests and state institutions, in the opinion of Çamoglu, is beginning to be eroded in the United States too. Secondly, division of government. This is, as I wanted to show you, the polarization of parties and party discipline work against it. The speed with which the Republican Party in the Senate and in the House of Representatives rallied around Trump is fantastic, especially given their position in pre-election setting. An independent court. This is where the problem is that the president appoints judges to the Supreme Court and the prosecutor general, and that is the Minister of Justice, and has here also a great say over the institutions of the executive. And unlike, say, the British system, where civil service, where by definition is not partisan, unlike the UK situation, in the United States, the president appoints 4,000 upper officials who are under his direct control. And again, I'm quoting Çamoglu, and I can say that the purpose of the founding fathers was to set up a strong federal government so that they could balance the power of the states guaranteed by the Confederation. And the division of government was supposed to balance a strong presidential authority. And in all probability, so far, it hasn't much worked at the federal level. And those minor, as he puts it, liberal bubbles in individual states such as New York, California, Vermont, and Massachusetts seem to seek to balance it. In other words, the conclusion is that the resistance of the democratic institution per se is not guaranteed without the resistance of civil society. So much for the United States. Now, going back to France. I suppose that we also have something to say with the obvious crisis, maybe even further, more marked of the crisis of the presidential system. For the first time in the history of the Fifth Republic, the active president, François Hollande, refused to put his candidature for the second term, very much like in Latin America, under profound socio-economic and psychological crisis. Somebody who has huge powers, that is the president of France, and they're much more than what the American president has, because the French president has the right to disband the Congress, to disband l'Assemblée nationale, but under this condition, when he has huge power, that is the president and his party become weak figures, speaking in Latin American language, become the main culprits and the ones who are responsible. So, given the outcome of the political elections in France, which we're now witnessing, and in the crisis of presidential system, many factors come into play, apart from those that I mentioned. First of all, irritation of the voters against the self-interest and the uselessness of the ruling class. Secondly, this is irritation against the French state. Economically, let me put it this way, this is the most strongest state in Europe. This is the highest share of state expenditure in the GDP, that is 57%. And at the very same time, This is certainly lower than what you see in Italy and Spain, but still very high unemployment, especially among the youth, which may reach as high as 25% among people are aged between 18 to 25. High taxes, traditionally very strong state regulation, and stagnating living standard. But on the other hand, in France, they have the largest Muslim community in Europe, 7 million immigrants, and France in the 2015-2016 had several major terror attacks, and since November 2015 has been living under the state of emergency. In other words, this is a crisis of presidential system. In other words, a crisis of presidential monarchy. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, one of the main suggestions he made was to transfer from the fifth presidential republic to the sixth parliamentary republic in France. He suggested this sort of transition. The main reason for the crisis is the crisis of the party system, which is far more marked than what we see in the United States. This is a crisis of the party system, which was the grounds for stability of the Fifth Republic. When the right centrist bloc and de Gaulle champions, they're known as the Republicans, and the left-centric, they are mostly manifested by the Socialist Party, and their alternation was the basis of this political system since, and has been so since 1958. The carrying pillars of this turned out to be very weakened during the election campaign. The main choice has taken place and will take place on the 7th of May between the candidates who announced either, well, against the existing system or non-system outsider candidates. Although I will put it again, I'll go back to it if I have time, that for the both winners, the name of non-system candidate, to put it softly, it's an over-exaggeration. They both are very much well fit into the system. To begin with, Marine Le Pen graduated from the Panthéon Assas University, that is the School of Law of Paris University, and Emmanuel Macron is the National School of Administration, also an elitist educational establishment. Though she was a very successful lawyer, well, speaking about Macron, he's a banker from the Rothschild House. He's a Minister of Economy in the Socialist government of Wales, in the government of President Hollande. In other words, with a greater sort of tension, I would put it this way, is non-system candidates or outsiders. Speaking about the crisis of party system, we should start by saying that at the primaries in the both parties, they were won by the candidates, outsiders that were not supported by the party establishment. The Republicans, that is the right party, rejected the candidate of the former President Nicolas Sarkozy, and the seeming favorite, as the political service showed, Alain Juppé, in favor of François Fillon, who was never seen as a favorite. Socialists did not support the candidature of Emmanuel Valls either, who quit to be elected as president, and supported the candidate of Benoît Hamon, former minister, and the government of Hollande, who again left the government, who was Minister of Education, and who left his post in 2014. Secondly, both candidates from the two main parties didn't get into the second tour, overall having collected all of them, 25% of votes. This was something that could never be conceived before. The last time they saw this sort of more or less situation too, when Jean-Marie Le Pen went into the second tour, he won only 16.9% of all votes, and that was the only case, and he was the only sort of candidate. For this reason, I'd like to say that this crisis, to a great extent, although it certainly weakened the right too, it certainly first hit the Socialist Party. And as Benoît Hamon admitted his loss, he said it's a very severe loss, we should make our own conclusions. Actually, this is the process that is very common for the West, the crisis of the leftist and social democratic parties. As the French philosopher Michel Lefebvre put it, they are in a trap of innocent liberalism of the 1990s. What he means is that, first and foremost, New Labour, that is Tony Blair, and Clinton's policy, which led these parties to political failure, to inability to understand the problems that brought about new social and generational split in the European countries. Socialists and social democrats who supported many countries' neoliberal socio-economic courses stopped being an alternative to to champions of conservative party. In most countries such as Greece, Denmark, Poland, UK, Germany, France, Finland, socialist and social democratic parties are either under the threat of disappearance, like PASOK in Greece, or got worst results in history, and most of them were removed from government. And I'd like to say that the coalition in Europe, we see still 3 countries where coalition led by Social Democrats is still in government. They are, first of all, Sweden, where we are right now, secondly, Portugal, and Austria. So, as I already put it, in the general, the crisis of the electoral base of socialist parties, it's usually linked, and it is linked, to the automation and globalization processes. Although put it this way, in Germany, for example, robots, as statistics show, there are 3 times more robots per one worker than what they see in France. But at that, unemployment in Germany, as the most recent data, is 3.9% against 10% in France. And Germany, is far more, if I may put it this way, globalized country. Unlike France, this is one of the leading exporters in the world. In other words, not all problems boil down to globalization, which is understood literally in this way, is some kind of objective process and a certain predetermined fact. No, quite an important role is played by the economic policy by the government. But nevertheless, it is a fact that the voters of the socialist parties either move to the right populist, anti-immigrant, xenophobic political forces, thinking the immigrants as the main culprit of all the problems they have. The other portion of voters go left, towards left populist parties that come forward with radical change of the political systems so that we should let the citizens an immediate access to decision making. This is the Podemos in Spain, which I mentioned, and unconquered France, or Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And what I want to say, that the mass discontent among the rank-and-file members of these parties lead to the fact that they reject what their party apparatus decide in their decisions. And we see radicalization when we see sort of major shift to the left of the rank-and-file members, which they start to support Jeremy Corbyn, Benoît Hamon in France, or, it's a different story though, but Pedro Sanchez in Spain. So they are seeing a situation where most of rank-and-file members of the parties, as well as radical leaders, oppose the bulk of the party establishment and considerable portion of the older electorate. Well, Jeremy Corbyn, after Brexit, despite the fact that the whole of the parliamentary party, Labour Party, went against him, he was nevertheless re-elected with even better success to become the leader of the Labour Party. And again, here I want to say that, as I understand it, the parliament system, that is, example of Spain gives it best example. The parliamentary system, despite its profound crisis of the party system, Spain is moving away from the 2-party system to the 4-party system. Alongside with the Popular Party, they have the Spanish Socialist Party. There are 2 more parties, Ciudadanos and Podemos, arise. This situation which leads to a most profound government crisis, to 2 elections in a row in 2016, and so on. But nevertheless, again, December 15, June 16, that is twice parliamentary elections that could not resolve the situation, where the government could not obtain a majority in the parliament. Nevertheless, It seems to me that in the parliamentary system of Spain, we are seeing a great transition from the two-party system to four parties. Whereas the presidential system in France, the crisis is hitting it with the two leading parties, may lead to a sort of system without parties, where two out of four main candidates, that is Emmanuel Macron and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, were leading amorphous coalitions that were set up like ad hoc for the elections. The parties were put forward Marine Le Pen, which is a non-system party, and François Fillon. Again, a few words in the time that is left to me about the phenomenon of the right populism, phenomenon of the National Front, Front Populaire. It was set up in 1972 as an ultra-right party. That was a union between two former collaborators with Nazism and former veterans of the war in Algeria. So far, Jean-Marie Le Pen was actually a veteran of the war in Algeria. And his first electoral success, this party achieved in the 1980s, as it spoke against immigrants, against people with a dark skin, and on loud anti-Semitic claims. Now led by Marine Le Pen, this is a generally acknowledged party that brought together the middle class, all those who feel they were betrayed by the old political system. This, as many people say, is the first working party in France. The general motto against workers and former communists, especially in the north east of France, the left have betrayed us and abandoned us. It's not so much about immigration. I quote what the voters of Marine Le Pen say. It's not so much for immigration. The thing is that we've had enough. We've had enough. And as the French geographer believes, Christophe Guilly, his book is known as Peripheral France. He says that in most, the dividing line in France doesn't run along ethnic divide. It's not so much about ethnicity or it's territorial. France of the center, France in Paris, France of the cities against France in the periphery. Paris and big cities tied to globalization and competing, something that competes with London, Shanghai, and New York, and the province ignored and for something that was forgotten. First is the France of the liberals, who are all in the champions of the free society and free and never-ending mobility. That's why she was ranked as number 5 in Paris, Marine Le Pen. And politically, it's represented again by this France number 1, by the right and the left center. The second is the France of the periphery, where people believe there is an alternative that is non-liberal economic model based upon protectionism, based upon industry being brought back to France, and on preserving the strong state. In this sort of second France, Christophe Guilly identifies two national fronts, one in the south, in the Mediterranean. This is a traditional sort of bulk of the national front, where the aging population of the locals is facing immigrant youth. This is the traditional front that speaks against the immigrants. The second front in the former industrial cities of the northeast, from Dunkirk to others, it became the victim of deindustrialization. This is the National Front, really attracts the voters by the motives that are close to the left. And indeed, the voters in the National Front don't look like a cartoon. They have nothing to do with the traditional ultra-right activist, something that is perceived like mock cartoon-like of Father Le Pen, Le Pen le Senior. They are really looking at the rational analysis of what they lived through. Their conclusions may be doubtful, but they could be explained. This is not racism. The left doesn't work. The rights don't work. We should give it a try, something else. That is Marine Le Pen. Further on, today, the left do not defend the workers. What was represented by the Communist Party 40 years ago, at the time of its apogee, when it also won as much as 20% of the votes, nowadays this is put forward by the National Front. This is the first party of French workers. This is how things stand with the crisis of the party system, and this is how this was accumulated by the National Front. Now, another thing in the French presidential system, which I considered in the United States and which in France is more successful. This is protection from marginals, sort of being foolproof against marginals. In France, this is the second tour when everybody unites against the National Front. This happened in 2002, when in the second tour, Jean-Marie Le Pen added to his 17% only 2 more percent and reached 19% support in all France, went to support this wonderful democratic candidate such as Jacques Chirac, who won a triumphant victory just out of fear what things have led them to. In the same way can be said, and this is probably something we will see right now, at least candidates from the two leading parties, that is, two traditional parties such as Benoît Hamon from the Socialist Party and many President of France, François Hollande, and many figures both from the left and the right, including François Fillon, urged to support Macron against Marine Le Pen in the second tour, having thus created a Republican front. So one more thing I wish to say, such an interesting phenomenon that is left populism, the new left as...
And here I mean La France Insoumise, presided by Monsieur Mélenchon, who really made the greatest breakthrough in the presidential campaign, having broken through to 19% in the first tour. Indeed, he harvested the votes of those who had previously supported socialists. And what was important here to support and to supply, to increase the social disbursements and Francois, and to decrease the pension age, to renegotiate the European treaties and agreements, and to indeed limit the payments and the bonuses to the top management of corporations. Monsieur Mélenchon speaks a lot about the Bernie Sanders and the Spanish socialists losing, and in the same way, they say that the movement must be above the above party. It should be a transversal, something that the movement must cut through party lines and cut across party lines, whereby the Sixth Republic must finish with the presidential monarchy, introduce the referendum, and indeed renegotiate the European treaties. It is also supported that there is the distinct link with Monsieur Mélenchon and the Latin American populism, whereby the very idea comes from the Ecuadorian president, Mr. Carrier, who is appealing to such presidents as Lula in Brazil or late Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. So cutting across party lines means that the movements must talk directly to the people, trying to rally the people around some social projects which are in the benefit of the people who suffer from the neoliberal economic policies. Interestingly, that the spectrum in the first tour of the French elections was almost can be divided into 5 parts: Mélenchon, Macron, Le Pen, Fillon, Le Pen, Fillon, and finally those 20 who did not vote. So 1/5 of the electorate believed that this program of Monsieur Mélenchon may be supported. Monsieur Mélenchon and Madame Le Pen coincide in their advocacy for leaving the EU, but on the migration, they definitely are at the polar points, whereas Le Pen is against any immigration, and Mélenchon is for open France. An interesting point here is also, while we have one choice, the candidate that your first choice. Who is your second choice? So among the voters of Le Pen, 28% were those who were ready to choose Monsieur Mélenchon as their second choice, about one-third, mind you. But among the Mélenchon voters, there were only 11% of those who were going to vote or would be ready to vote for the head of the Popular Front. So my last observation in this seemingly interminable presentation is about this Latin American parallels. These Latin American parallels are not accidental. This appeal to the leader, the Vozhd area, or the Vozhd ideology, the leader ideology, is always anti-elitist. And it is always a reflection of the deep crisis of institutions and their inability to act as reliable channels of communication. In this sense, both Le Pen and Trump vote in or speak in the name of the people. In this sense, the General de Gaulle was probably one of the very first in the very modern history of the Fifth Republic, who was indeed the first person to vote or to speak on the name of on behalf of the people. So populism in its contemporary image is primarily a Latin American phenomenon. Which had great social appeal in America, whereby the nation became the greatest agent, so to speak, where the class and social identity stopped being the critical for most of the population. And in this way, this Latin American dimension is an interesting phenomenon, even though there are some important the important social moment, both in France, in Spain, and by quoting from Chantal Mouffe, who lives in London, she says that as distinct from the authoritarian right-wing populism, which limits democracy, the left-wing populism vies for deepening of the democratic processes by forming this identity around the so-called popular image. And this is so what are the possible conclusions? Let me just say that we have encountered the great crisis of the liberal democracies, probably the greatest crisis over the past 70 years. Secondly, it is still ill understood how these institutions may transform for them to yet again be perceived as champions of the people. Mr. Eriksson spoke about the institutional tasks. I think that it is important to try and understand how can people who have been left behind or have perceived themselves to be left behind, how they can emancipate back into a political stance. Well, finally, populism, I think, is the greatest danger to today's democracy. And finally, the left-wing populism in France and Spain may encounter the same problems as in Latin America, where the championing of the poor lead such parties to gradual erosion of the democratic institutions. Because such a system usually ostracizes any pluralism and supports for left-wing authoritarianism. As I have written in El País regarding Podemos, those who have voted right all their lives would never vote left, whatever is the candy on offer. So at this, let me conclude, and I will try to take up your questions.